Well, I guess the focus of today's get-together is education, bilingualism, that sort of thing. One of my particular interests is in identity maintenance, ethnic maintenance, especially amongst diaspora populations and immigrant populations, where you are vastly outnumbered by the outside world. And there's a difference, in the case of Roma, there's a difference because there's no homeland. If you are, let's say, a German immigrant, you can think in your mind, even if you never go back there is a place that you belong to in some sense. But in particular for Roma, and I suppose up until, 1948 for Jews, before Israel, there was no homeland. And it's very important to have a homeland psychologically. It roots you psychologically. And also, in a sense, it gives you a feeling of security, because presumably you could go there if you had to get away from whatever you had to get away from. But in the case of Roma, that is still not true. So I think I should give you briefly a little history of who and what Roma are. And then, you can ask questions. We have a homeland, which is India, but that knowledge was not retained. It was a memory that just became lost very early on. And that in itself presented probably the first problem, because when the Western world would ask, "Where are you from?" they didn't get an answer that made any sense. That led to all kinds of other names being applied to Roma. And the name that caught on in English anyway, and a number of other languages, was Egyptian or gypsy. And that word, for various reasons, has been interpreted in the English-speaking world particularly as representing a behavior rather than an actual people. And I made the point yesterday that it's even usually written with a small g, not even a capital letter, because people think it's a behavior. And this has caused confusion too in India, because there was a British administrator called Ibbotson back in the 1800s who, when he observed various nomadic populations in India, called them gypsies because they reminded him up to a point of Roma gypsies in England, because they moved about and lived in tents and so on. So the word gypsy is used in India commonly for such populations, but in actual fact, most of those groups have nothing to do with the Romani population. However, some of them do. And the history as we understand it now is that our ancestors left India about 1,000 years ago as a result of the gradual takeover of northwestern India, north central India, by the Ghaznavid, the Muhammad of Ghazni's empire. And over the course of maybe a quarter of a century, they just invaded and took many, many prisoners of war. The prisoners of war consisted of smaller numbers of actual troops who were from the kshatriya, the military caste, but the greater number consisted of the service providers. And that's important to count them into the history, because this is where you get the female genetic element as well. Of course, the fighters were just men, but the camp followers were men and women. And they were taken out in huge numbers westwards into the heartland of the Ghaznavid Empire. But the Ghaznavids themselves were, and I should say, there was no single India at this time. There were different kingdoms with different rulers, but each one of those areas was under threat, and each one of those areas would assemble armies to try and stop the eastwards incursion of Islam. And so the people who were assembled came from a number of different ethno-linguistic Indian populations, most of them speaking related languages. And we're talking about 1,000 years ago, so things were closer back then than they are today. Nevertheless, it was necessary for, in the army camps and in the prisoner of war camps and so on, that the various different Indians speaking various different languages had to work out a kind of lingua franca. And something that comes a bit close to that might be Urdu, which the very name is not even an Indian word. It's a Turkish word meaning a battle camp, an army camp. It's where the English word horde comes from. And there's a great deal of Persian in there, because this was also the official military language, not only of the Hindu armies, but also of the Islamic armies. Although they were enemies, they both used Persian. Urdu has a lot of Persian because it became part of the Islamic side of things, not the Hindu side. But the Ghaznavids were also fighting on the Western Front with another empire, the Seljuk Empire, also Islamic, but enemies. And the Seljuks defeated the Ghaznavids in 1038 and immediately freed the Indian POWs and used them to help to fight for them, and brought them further west because they also were fighting the Armenians, and in 1071 they defeated Kingdom of Armenia, which geographically was at the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia. And this brought a large mixed Indian population this far west into Anatolia, into the Byzantine sphere of influence. At this point, it settled down, and there were various, they call in Turkish beyliks, kind of semi-autonomous regions, divided up ethnically, and there were a lot of Indians now settled, and through intermarriage, and one characteristic of Indians outside of India is that the caste divisions weaken to an extent, so that while marrying across caste lines in India, especially in rural India, is strictly adhered to, once you are in, I don't know, Trinidad, Fiji, Tanzania, America. The fact of being Indian in a foreign land is more important than being Vaisya or Kshatriya or something, because you want to still stay Indian. So you start to get intermarriage, and a mixed population that was identified by profession is now acquiring an ethnic identity. And this lingua franca language is becoming a native language. It's becoming Romani, under the influence of medieval Greek. When I teach about the language in particular, I use the metaphor of an onion, layer upon layer upon layer. And the core is Indian. But as the people move in a kind of northwesterly direction out of India, words are picked up along the way. And what is interesting is that there's a tiny language called Burushaski, spoken way up in the Hansa in the Himalayas. And there are about 16 words in Romani from this language.
I'm giving you this because that is a whiteboard, if you want to write. I know you wanted one yesterday, so.
Well, I don't know. We're talking about this area here, really, but the movement is up through, and you have to remember that you can only, and keep in mind it's 1,000 years ago, no airplanes or anything, you can only get out of India in a few passes through the mountains. Even more restricted if you're moving with buffalo and camels and so on, and troops. We know that it must have been up through a particular route because of what's picked up. We've got the core vocabulary is connected with the central Indian languages. And this is where we do our party piece. You speak Hindi, and I will say the Romani word, and you give me the Hindi word, and you'll see after 1,000 or more years how similar they still are. Nak,
Nak,
kan,
kan,
bal,
bal,
dan,
dant,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, I make my case, right? What am I saying if I say me pyao pani?
I want to drink water, or I'm
Yeah,
drinking water.
I'm drinking water. Yeah, I mean, okay, you get the idea. But at the same time, keep in mind that we have our language after centuries with no country, no government, scattered all over the world. I can go to any country where there are Roma and we can talk to each other. Why should that be? How does it be? So that's something to think about. Anyway, there are Dardic words, quite a few Dardic words in Romani as well. But these are languages that are sort of partway between Indic and Iranic. There's a lot of Persian words. As we move this way and up, then we get Armenian words, and I think I said yesterday, this is probably where Christianity was first encountered, because the word for Easter is an Armenian word. The word for incense in a church is an Armenian word, and so on. The word for the Christian cross, well, this thing this is Shiva's trident. The word for this in Indian, let's just call it Indian, is Trishula. if you take the trident and bend these things downwards, you get the cross. Our word for the cross is trushel. But it's a word that comes from a three-pronged thing. Our word for a priest is, this is how you spell it. It's pronounced Rashai. This is Rishi. It's a Hindu title that's converted to a Christian one. So it's a semantic jump in a way. So the Romani population takes shape in Anatolia and is then pushed even further west into Europe, again because of the spread of Islam, this time the Ottoman Turks moving this way. The Indian connection is not just in the language, it's in our bloodline. We all have genetic markers which are Indian, and a bunch of other stuff, of course. Our culture has a great deal of Indian in it, our religion, our flag. We have, this is on our flag, it's a chakra, it's the Ashokan chakra. It's on everything. If you Google images and Romani flag, I mean, that's all you're going to get.
It was on the flyer. They saw that.
It's on the flyer. So part of what we have inherited is this concept of being clean, not only physically, but in a way spiritually. And you can be defiled in a lot of different ways. We call people who are not Roma, we call Gaje. And this comes from an old Indic root, Gaja, which means a country person or a civilian, a non-military person. Another word we use for people who are not Roma is Goro, which means a prisoner of war. There are a lot of words which have this military association. And it's because of knowing words like this that we've partly been able to reconstruct the history. The association with metalworking, which is part of the stereotype, is actually a characteristic that was picked up in the Byzantine period. All of the words having to do with metalworking are Byzantine Greek words. They're not Indian words. There are only three words in Romani for metals which are Indian. The word for silver, which is rup, the word for gold, which is sunakai, and the word for iron, which is sastri. Now, sastri is not the word for iron in India, but it's the word for weapon in some. So here's another semantic shift from the material the weapon is made of to the the name of the material becomes the name for the, you know what I'm trying to say. It's a semantic shift. So it still refers to weaponry. But what keeps Romani populations existing is this barrier that separates the Romani world from the non-Romani world, and it is based on this idea of defilement. We have different words. There's a word for being dirty in dirt, in physical dirt, which is melalo or chikalo, words like this, which means dirt and mud and so on. But the other word Makerdo would mean spiritually defiled. And this comes from a verb, mak, it means to smear or stain. Do you recognize that one? But it's a reference to menstrual blood, because a man is defiled by that contact. And there are these divisions. My feminist students start to get uneasy at this part. But I'm telling you how it is. The genders are strictly separated, although gender roles are not the same as in the Anglo world. For example, we can kiss each other on the mouth and hold hands and dance together, and that's not seen as unmanly. If a man, I was telling you this, if a man cannot cook, his friends will laugh at him. They'll say, well, you're not self-sufficient. You have to rely on someone. What sort of a man are you? Women.
I don't like that.
So, women will work alongside men in the dirtiest of jobs and do exactly what the men do. So gender roles are different, but they're clearly defined. And just as Gage have lots and lots of stereotypes about Rama, we have lots and lots of stereotypes about all of y'all.
There's some Texas coming up.
So anyway, the thing is, you can become defiled by associating with people who are already in an unclean state, which is Gage. Gage are not unclean genetically. You're not unclean because you're not Ramani. You're unclean because you don't live properly. Because if you were to marry me and you're not Ramani, you would be taught by the other women how to cook, how to behave, how to dress, which then you would not be untouchable in a sense. But because these, and if you do start to transgress and not maintain these behaviors, which involve how you wash things, if you go into a Ramani house, even here, in town here, you would see 3 different bowls for washing 3 different kinds of things. You would never wash eating things with wearing things, for example. And there would be 3 different color soaps, so you wouldn't mix up soaps. Your upper body and your lower body have to be kept separate, so you have 2 different kinds of towels. You dry your upper body with one kind of towel and not use the same for your lower body. You wouldn't mix men's and women's, and so on and so on and so on. You couldn't, women are in an unclean state each month and around the time of childbirth when somebody else would be cooking. And it's pretty complicated, but and then we also believe that if you don't observe these behaviors, your balance, your quintala, you have a thing, it's called ji, but it means could be your soul, your spiritual batteries. They have to be kept charged up. And you keep them charged up by living properly and by being with other Roma. That's important. As soon as you go amongst Gage, you're being threatened all the time, all around. And your quintala, your spiritual balance will start to tip. As soon as that happens, your health, your luck, things will start to go wrong. There's no such thing as an accident or coincidence in the Ramani world. There's a reason for every single thing. And it's like karma, in a way. So Ramani families will not send their kids to American schools. because it means eating food prepared by Gaje. It means having your children sit next to Gaje. If you want a close parallel, the one I always use because most Americans are familiar with Orthodox Jews, where you have restrictions on food, who you sit with, who you touch. Roma usually won't shake hands, even with other Roma. You have your own plates and cups. Some families, some really conservative families, will eat with their fingers, or if they drink something, won't touch it right onto their mouth, but hold it a little bit away. If they are smoking a pipe or a cigarette, they won't put that directly on their mouth, but kind of draw it through their fist like this. There's all kinds of little behaviors like this, which are observed by very conservative families. And they're more conservative in America than in Europe, because here it's been possible to become invisible. First of all, the average American, when you think of gypsy, you think of Esmeralda, right? Not the real people. Secondly, this is a multi-ethnic nation made up of people from all over the world. In Europe, Roma were the first people of color in the white world, so you could spot them. In this country, you know, if you're light like I am, they think you're white. If you're a little bit darker, they think you're Hispanic. There's one family in San Antonio, they think they're African American. You know, there are no Roma who are undiluted Indian after 1,000 years. So how we've kept it together is the result of internal factors, like these ideas of maintaining separateness, but external factors, like legislation against Roma, which is what I talked about more yesterday. Fear of the outsider, suspicion. One of the things brought from India, partly as a cultural thing, but also as a necessary and protective thing, is fortune telling. That is part of the stereotype. But fortune telling in India is a respected profession. In the West, it's viewed with skepticism, although a lot of people do their horoscopes and go to fortune tellers, but they will be, and they'll keep quiet about it. But it's a...
She posts her horoscope all the time.
But the legislation from the earliest times in Europe have led to Roma being moved on and having to leave everything. And obviously, if you've got to leave heavy equipment, your livelihood behind, that's not the kind of livelihood you can have. But fortune telling, you don't need anything. I mean, cards, palm, you can just pick up and go and take it with you. Also, in the especially superstitious medieval population, if you could encourage the idea that somehow you have powers, people might be less quick to hurt you for fear of curses and so on. So that's also played into the stereotype. But you have to understand why in the first place. So that's a very brief history, and I better stop there so you can ask me some questions.
Perfect.
Okay.
You can go first. So you've done a lot of activism within the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so how, just as somebody who would like to balance scholarship with activism, how have you managed to strike that balance and use your scholarship for activism and your activism for scholarship? Like how have you done that?
Well, what I've tried to do, and when other Roma ask me why do I do what I do, and I say, you can go to most libraries and find one or two books about gypsies. And every time they are written by people who are not Roma. And they're full of nonsense for the most part. They really are wildly inaccurate. So what I'm trying to do is give you the story from the inside to try and correct some of that stuff. And there are others like me, especially in Europe. Not in this country so much, but in Europe, I'm not unusual, people like me. Because I have academic status, I've got a university affiliation, that gives me credibility because people are skeptical, gypsy, they're on guard, that word. But they cannot be so skeptical knowing a bit about me. So they sort of have to take me partway seriously. So that's a good thing. But the other side is, how do I fit into the Romani world? Because part of having a Romani identity, it's a twofold thing. One is you have to have genetic bloodline descent from Roma. You can't convert, you can't become Romani. But that alone is not enough. You also have to be part of a community and be with other Roma on a regular basis. Speak the language as often as you can. And I'm lucky in that I'm in touch with Roma every day through the World Wide Web. But in Austin also there's a very big Romani population. So I can spend time with my own people and also spend time in the non-Romani world. And a phrase I used this morning is cultural schizophrenia. Somebody called Lagarde Quast came up with that phrase, but it made a lot of sense to me. If you belong to two cultures, or you function in two cultures, you behave very differently. You become a different person. How you interact, even how you hold yourself. I mean, it's remarkable. People should look at this a bit more closely. And you walk a kind of tightrope with a foot in two worlds, and you learn to do that. If you are a member of a minority population, but you function in the majority. So.
I have a question to add on to Jessica. I'm not sure if somebody else is raising their hand. To kind of build off of the scholarship and activism balance, one question that I'm interested in learning more about is how you are trying to reach wider audiences, because you had mentioned before that being
Did you say whiter audiences or wider audiences?
Wider, like
I was thinking the same.
How do I?
yeah.
Well, they pretty well come looking for me.
Oh.
Yes,
That's
Yeah.
convenient.
sometimes.
Sometimes he doesn't want them.
Yeah. No, that I don't have a problem reaching out. Especially journalists. But journalists very often want the wrong kind of response from me. They want confirmation of their stereotypes. And then that's a little more difficult.
So I'm actually wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the educational practices in the communities. And this is coming from someone who has not studied Romani communities. As you mentioned that going to school would be problematic, would have a lot of cultural tensions that would arise in a public school. So what is a typical educational pattern for a child growing up in the communities? How is education conceived or imagined, and what do children do as they grow up?
Well, first thing you have to understand is that we're not talking about a single homogeneous population. There are many different Romani populations who retain Romani Pen to a greater or a lesser extent. The groups that are the most conservative happen to be the largest group in this country. Most Romani Americans belong to the group called Vlach. I should write these things up. In our spelling, the letter X represents ch, and this word Vlach actually comes from this word Wallachia, which is a principality in Romania. And in Romania, there were two. There was Wallachia and Moldavia. And these were where the Roma were held as slaves almost immediately on coming into Europe. At the time of the Ottomans coming in, they were held as slaves up until about 1860. And then in huge numbers left after abolition. And they spread out everywhere, but a good many crossed over to North and South America. And so the most Romani Americans come from this particular population who, because they were slaves and kept in slave quarters away from everyone else, retained an awful lot of the original culture, etc. But there are other Romani populations here from other parts of Europe who have lost a lot of that. They kept some and lost other. So there are Romani groups who send their kids to school. Vlach Roma don't. They might send children for a short while to learn to read and write, because non-literacy is the norm. I don't say illiteracy.
Yeah, non-print.
Well, I say non-literacy because it's deliberate.
Okay.
For a long time, before the internet, of course, it was believed that learning to read opened up the rest of the world. It was dangerous to learn to read. But these days it's necessary. So kids will read for parents. And if you get a copy, if you're really interested in reading more about this, there's a book called Danger, Educated Gypsy. You can get it on Amazon. And it's a collection of essays. It's edited by Dilip Karant, he's an Indian guy. And there's a chapter on education in there, which you'll find interesting. First of all, as I say, attending school is avoided for various reasons. Basically, cultural. It means you're in the non-Romani world. But for other reasons as well. First of all, it would have your kids sitting next to Gaje kids, and you don't want any romantic things to develop. Secondly, the classes present aspects of culture which are completely opposite to Romani values. For example, and we were talking about this morning too, Romani culture is extremely homophobic because the idea of quintala, of balance, has to involve a plus and a minus. You can't have two pluses or two minuses. Everything will go wrong. And yet, and my kids went to school, but when Melina was a little girl, she came home with a book, Barbara Has Two Mummies, you know, and in mainstream culture that's not unusual, but in Romani culture that's really unusual. And it's a conflict of values. So what do? Do you give up your own culture and assimilate to somebody else's culture, or what do you do? Another thing would be individuals in, say, mainstream history lessons who are heroes in history may have sent Roma to their deaths in history, kings and so on, directly responsible for, you know, mass murder and so on. And people will say they're not going to learn anything that's going to help them to be better Roma. They can learn all of that at home. Secondly, marriages are arranged at a very early age. It's not unusual for a girl to be, say, 12 or 13 when she gets married. And it's arranged by both families. Obviously, they're not love matches, they're business arrangements to keep power and control of areas and income and so on. And they will start to bring income into the family at that age. Boys will go out and work with their dads, and young girls will often learn trabarimos, which means fortune telling. And they'll be bringing money into the family. There's a saying in Romani, Buchale Butbacht, which means many children, much luck. Children bring you luck. And all of that is so diametrically opposite from, I don't like to say Anglo, but just non-Romani culture. It's very similar to non-Western values, but it's not similar to Western values. And it's possibly because of these differences that the barrier is so firmly in place. If you were to go into one of the local reader advisor places, fortune telling places, as a couple in town, you'd be welcomed in. You might be given a cup of coffee, you'd be asked to sit down, but the seat would probably have plastic on it. You wouldn't be allowed any further into the house. The cup would be only for gage. You wouldn't be told this, it would hurt your feelings. But you couldn't, if you drank from it, you would have defiled the cup. If something falls on the floor in a Romani kitchen, you throw it away. I mean, it's that strict. We believe, here's another difference, is when family members die, the soul, the ji, doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go up to heaven. It's right there. You can talk to them and ask advice, and they will advise you and so on. And let's say you're in the kitchen preparing something to eat, or cutting up carrots and potatoes and so on, and maybe a piece of potato falls on the floor. You would have to throw that away. If a knife or a fork fell on the floor, you'd have to throw it away. But let's say you're all by yourself, you pick it up and rinse it off and throw it back in the pot. You might say, nobody saw. But the moule, our moule, saw. and they will send you something we call prikaza, which is like a warning sign. So a couple of minutes later, you might nick your finger with the knife. Not an accident. That's just a little warning that we saw what you did. You know, don't tip it.
I don't even have any silverware left.
But that is true. That is true. And what American Roma have done, a cultural adaptation, it is now permissible to soak such a thing in Clorox overnight to make it clean again. Yes.
Okay.
The power of Clorox.
Married women must always cover their heads. But nowadays you look a bit conspicuous, but you still have to cover your head. So you'll see women will wear maybe a little brooch or something on top. Looks like just an ornament, a decoration, but really it's a sign that you're married. And you're married at early age, but we have different words for boy, girl, man, woman. First of all, whether you're Romani or not, a non-Romani girl is a rakli, which is lurki. Rakli, so Eleanor. A Romani girl is a che. A non-Romani man is a gajo. A Romani man is a rom. A Romani woman, if she's married, is a romni. You become a woman, at least that word, as soon as you're married. So you could be 12 years old, but if you're a wife, you're a romni. If you are 40 years old and single, which would be very unusual, you are a she. You are a she. You're still called a girl because you're not a wife. That's what's important, and having kids. And if you don't have kids right away, because the whole purpose is to propagate Roma. Okay. More questions?
There are lots of schools in Europe, for example, that have many Romani children. I know I read about school situations with a lot of Roma children being put in special education in the Czech Republic and things like that. Also, Jen, I wanted to tell you, if you're interested in something that talks about Romani children in the U.S., do you remember I have this toolkit. I can't remember the author's name, but I got it from she's a Roma woman and she developed it, and it was on the listserv, and she sent it to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really good. It's
What is her name? She's in California.
I have it though. I can send it to you. And it's really informative. It tells some of the same types of information, but then it talks about if you have Roma children in your schools, because there are children that go to school even in the U.S. I think even in New York, there's. I'm trying to think. There's some areas where there might be more places where more Roma children are found in schools, but especially in Europe is where you hear a lot of the issues that some of those students have had with mistreatment, because the things that he talked about, some of these major differences. But then you imagine they're coming from how others view them and how teachers are viewing Roma.
But back in the 70s, there was federal money for parochial schools. And there were a number of Romani schools. They started up in Portland and Seattle and Spokane, and then spread across Chicago down to San Francisco, and even to New Jersey. And they were reasonably successful. But they were controlled by Roma. The boys and girls were kept separate. The course content was suitable. The food in the cafeteria was all cooked by Roma. So everybody was happy with that. It's not that Roma avoid education, but it has to be in the right environment.
And what about print literacy for writing in Romani?
This all comes from Europe. It's very highly developed in Europe. I mean, we've got the Quran, we got the Bible, we got the Bhagavad Gita, all in Romani. Dictionaries, grammars, what have you. It's masses of stuff. Roma in this country, being as conservative as they are, can't even read and write English, the older people, let alone Romani.
And are there attempts to maintain that language in the written sense, or is it mostly verbal?
In Europe, there's a strong move to maintain it as a written vehicle, and even to create a standardized dialect, because there are so many different dialects. In this country, it maintains itself. There's a thing called a kris, which is, do you know panchayat? It's a tribunal, like a little court, and we have the same thing. And you cannot speak anything but Romani at a kris. If you slip into English, people will shout at you. You've got to talk Romani. Yeah. So it's part of the culture. There are people who will say, if you don't speak Romani, you're no longer really Romani. Yeah. Very important.
Well, I had 3 questions. You kind of answered 2 of them.
I think you answered a question.
But you said something last night, something about Romani, maybe if they were darker skinned, or they had certain jobs and they weren't considered like equal to other Romani. And so I'll ask my question the way that I have it written down. When I wrote it down, it made sense.
Go ahead.
Is it fair to say that some Romani are discriminating other Romani because they are darker skinned? And if and are they doing this because they're trying to disassociate with a less desirable Romani in order to promote a better image of the Romani people?
There are certainly attitudes from one group to another. Groups usually think they are the real Roma. Other groups, well, they're not Gaji, but they're not really Roma either, meaning they're not us. And that's really common. Some of this goes back to slavery, because the slaves, just as in this country, there were house slaves and field slaves. And the house slaves always felt superior because they worked for the white population, but they were also forced only to speak Romanian and not Romani. So their descendants don't speak Romani, yet they still feel superior. Everybody else thinks they're assholes, but they think they're wonderful, right? It has to do with the job. But color, no. For Roma, traditionally, there's this sort of cliche saying, how does it go? E mai kali, e mura, o mai gulo o soko. It means the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Why? Because the lighter, and remember we're talking about slavery, where the women were used by the white men sexually. So if you were light, it meant that this had happened in your family, which was a disgrace. So the darker you were, the less assaulted you had been in your bloodline. Unfortunately, Western values are creeping in, and there have been beauty contests in Czech Republic and Bulgaria for young Romani girls, teenage girls, where they try to look very un-Romani and bleach their hair and so on. And those values are creeping in, which is a great shame, but
So there has been this thing of, well, if you're fair-skinned, could you also receive, it would almost be the opposite then, right?
Well, yes, what you find in this country, Romani women will bleach their hair and lighten their skin if they feel they have to, because they present less of a threat. This country is scared of dark people because of its own history. And you're more likely to go, let's say, to get your fortune told, where she looks exotic, but she's not dark brown, right? And that's a business technique. It doesn't matter so much for men, but women will do it because they are more in direct contact with the non-Romani world. The women usually are the steady breadwinners in a Romani family. Yeah. And also the women are more the bearers of the culture than the men are. And really, although on the surface of it, the culture seems very, very much, it is macho. And it seems to be male dominated. The women have most of the power, but it's kind of behind the scenes. And this sounds kind of backwards, but a woman can pollute a man at any time. The reverse isn't true, but a woman can disgrace a man publicly with a simple gesture, various gestures, which I won't go into. And that is an ultimate power which is not reciprocal. So, but it's the organizations, the political organizations that are emerging are more run by Romani women than by Romani men. There's one emerging in this country, which is, it's all Romani women.
Which one is that? Which one?
I don't think it's got a name, but it's 4 or 5, and they're all educated, college educated Roma, so they're not in the Romani world anymore, but they can use their legitimate family histories at least to yeah, it's very complicated.
I have one kind of quick question, going back to some of the customs. There was an episode, it was when I was doing my project for intercultural communication, there was an episode of Law & Order SVU that featured a Roma family.
Oh yeah.
And I'm wondering just how accurate they got some of the things that they were portraying. And one of the things that I do remember is it was their son that had died, and the police kept coming around and saying his name. And one of the customs that they showed was they kept asking the police not to say his name because the soul won't rest as long as the name is said. Is that an accurate depiction, or?
I don't know how accurate that is. You can say the name, but what you will find is that if there are pictures of that person, the picture might be turned to the wall.
Okay.
There may be families who won't say the name, but I've never come across that. You get, we have these things called pomeni, which are tables for different events, and there will be a place for a deceased relative with a plate and everything and a chair, which will be empty,
Yeah.
but it will be for that person. Yeah.
Yeah. Miscalculation in their time. Maybe just one or two other questions before time's up. Did you have anything? Of course, since you're the only one, or both of you actually have a question.
I have another question, but yeah. Do you guys have questions?
I'm just wondering, I think most Gypsy people, they learn English as native language, right?
No.
Oh. So
No.
do they go to school
No.
to learn English? No.
No. Bless you.
And so you have highly developed reading materials in Europe
for Gypsy people,
Mhm.
but not related to like any other foreign language. Do you learn? I mean, Gypsy people learn.
There are very few monolingual Roma.
Mhm.
There are some in some parts of Europe, especially very young and very old people in remote areas, say in Romania, Slovakia, places like that. They don't know anything else but Romani. But generally, wherever there are Roma, they will speak at least two languages, which would be our own language and the national language. But this comes back to education. In the post-communist countries, the concepts of bilingual ed and bicultural ed are foreign concepts. You would be persecuted, and children who don't speak the national language well are treated as though they were mentally defective, and they're put in special schools for retarded children. They're not retarded at all, they just don't speak the national language well. They used to do this with Spanish speakers in Texas years ago. Nothing wrong with the brain, but they were treated as though there were.
So, is there any bilingual program?
In Europe, yes, there are several.
I mean, for Gypsy people only, like Romani
Yes.
and English.
Yes.
Romani.
Yes.
How did that conduct? I mean, how does that conduct there?
Well, it's not necessary here because all American Roma speak English as well. English is not a problem. It's spoken in a kind of distinctive way. You can always tell when we talk to each other, it changes a little bit. It's a bit like my Chicano students. If they're talking to each other in English, they sound different, even though it's still English. They sound differently from if they were still speaking English to an Anglo friend. The intonation changes and so on. It's an ethnolect, which is necessary, especially for Chicanos who don't have their ethnic language anymore. I mean, a lot of them don't speak Spanish, but they still need a linguistic identifier as part of who they are. Like Black English too. Yeah. You're from China?
Yeah. So you mean there's no like identified bilingual program, especially for Gypsy people in America?
It's not necessary. It's not necessary. Roma in America live much better than they do in Europe. Way better.
I mean, what kind of better you mean? Physically, psychologically?
Well, in Europe, there's this history of persecution, and Roma have been just pushed to the fringes. I mean, as slaves, as this, that, and the other, Holocaust. And the prejudice is so vicious, it's unbelievable. Here, most people are so unfamiliar with who Roma really are. They're they see it as a behavior, something in storybooks. That when they may have Roma living next door and not know it. Yeah. But I was going to tell you, there are a lot of Roma in Harbin, in the north of China. Are you from mainland?
Yeah, that's my hometown.
Harbin, it is full of Roma.
Really?
Yes, down from Soviet.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I would not have guessed.
But here's the story that everybody knows. All over the world they tell this same story, and it's called the Chinese Gypsy. And I'll make it short, but it's interesting that everybody knows this story. There's this little Romani family in Russia years ago, and the tradition then, as now, was to send the oldest sons away to other places to come back and say, would that be a good place for us to go and make a living? And they sent this oldest son away, and they would either come westwards into Europe or go south into China. And this one son goes to China, and he's gone for a very long time. And some years later, the family is still in there. They have a tavern, and this Chinese guy shows up. And he comes up and he's speaking Romani. And he sees his brother, hey, Micho. And they're saying, who is this person? Who is this Chinese guy speaking our language? He said, I'm your brother. I'm your brother. They're saying, impossible. And they keep asking him questions, and they have to say, yeah, it's you. How come you're Chinese? And it turns out in the story that he was going, I don't know, from Beijing to Canton or something in a train, and there was an awful train wreck. And he was badly disfigured and broke bones, and his face was all messed up. And they rushed him to a hospital, and he had plastic surgery. But he had been so badly disfigured that the surgeons didn't know what his background was. They assumed he was Chinese. So they reconstructed his face as Chinese. So he looked Chinese. And when he went back, he had to be there. But what's interesting about that story is everybody knows it. Even American Roma know the same story. Mm. But if you go back to Harbin, you should look for Roma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's another resource.
Did you ever hear about Roma in China? Did you ever?
I only watched that movie talking about gypsy people telling the fortune.
Which movie?
We watched one. It's called Gypsy Girls in
Oh,
China,
very
like
cool.
many years ago.
Yeah.
Like she's really pretty.
Yeah,
telling
Haley
fortune.
Mills, Gypsy Girl. That's from the 50s.
I think I mixed the Mexican people and gypsy because I went to Disneyland and went to like a Mexican pavilion and asked the lady, can you tell me the fortune? And I think she just feels so offensive.
Now we have in Chandigarh the Indian Institute of Romani Studies, and we have conferences there. And one of I said that Indian gypsies for the most part have nothing to do with Roma, but there is one such population that does have a shared history, and this is the Banjara, Lamani people, who have the same history, that during the time of the Islamic invasions, and they saw themselves as Rajput, so on, whether they were or not, I don't know, but they say they were. And they went off to fight to resist the Muslims and got taken prisoner and never came back. And they believe it's because they were taken out of India. And so there's this organization called Roma Banjara. And in fact, in the book, if you ever find it, there's a photo of the newspaper, Roma Banjara paper. And they send delegates to our conferences, and we go to their conferences. And we are, from Madam Gandhi's time, officially part of the Indian diaspora. We can become Indian citizens easily, which is very difficult for foreigners to do. So that connection is being revived, and the more we learn about our own history, the more important it is. But it backfires because it now gives white racists something to say about go back to India. You know, what are you doing here? Go back. And they've learned that from our websites. Just as most Roma are learning that for the first time.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
Do the Banjara speak the same or a similar language? No.
I mean, it's similar, just as Punjabi is similar words, but when you get whole sentences, because obviously our ancestors didn't leave with words for computer or brain surgery, or, astronaut. So all of words like that are modern words, but we either use the international words like televisia and so on, or we create metaphors. For example, internet. This is a good one. Our word for a grape is drak. But you can put an ending on that to mean a grapevine. So a drakin or drakalin means a grapevine. But we use that also to mean the internet. And it's not confusing. I heard it through the grapevine. You didn't hear it through a grape plant. And it works very well, and everybody can understand stuff like that.
Our time is up.
Okay.
I know. I don't know if we can stop the filming, but maybe if you two, you didn't have your questions answered, maybe you could, if you want to ask them, you could do that now.
I was just soaking in the different similarities and soaking everything in. I feel what you spoke about, I could tell. Especially even with the whole menstrual cycle thing for women, I think that is also very common in the Indian culture.
Oh, there's much more than that. Do you know what is loli dori?
No.
Loli dori means red thread.
Lal dori, yeah.
Okay. You say loli dori. But you put it on a baby for good luck. And
Are you familiar with that?
I guess,
There's something that
not so much in my community, but I think in parts
you
of
are
India.
Marathi?
I'm
Uh-huh.
yes.
You look a bit Marathi to me. Plus she told me.
I think when you said
Makabi.
to smear, that is, I think, more Marathi than. That word I think I can get through Marathi more than through Hindi.
All right, I'll ask you one more. Do you know the word darb?
Darb is grass.
Drug?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In
Medicine?
Yeah, like herb or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
The word we use for fortune telling is drabaripe. It comes from the word drab, which means medicine, and then you get a verb drabar, meaning to heal. Because fortune telling, we never call it fortune telling, we call it advising. And you are healing spiritually, not physical ills, but spiritual. So if you translate the Romani word for fortune teller, drabani, it means healer. So that puts a whole different perspective on it.